I heard this story not long ago, and I remember this is what my aunt, who worked in a nursing home, told me. She told me about a hospital or something like that, like a nursing home. And here, it was normal for the elderly to pass away, nothing unusual. At the time of the incident, she had only recently joined the nursing home. One day when she was on a shift, she saw a lot of people gathered from afar. She thought there might have been a dispute, so she came to inspect. It turned out that there was no dispute at all. It was just Miss Lu, an elderly person, who said that she was going to go somewhere really far away, so she insisted that she wanted to give the people all of her things. Her statement made my aunt very curious and wondered where she was going to move to or what had happened to her. Miss Lu didn't say clearly where she was going, but she told my aunt a strange thing, that she didn't have much time left to live because she had seen Miss Chen. Miss Lu's words made it very difficult for my aunt to understand, and it seemed that my aunt didn't even know who Miss Lu just mentioned, so she really wanted to know who this Miss Chen was. But when my aunt wanted to ask for more details, she was dragged away by a former employee. Later, the former employee told her about a rumor related to Miss Chen that anyone who saw her would die. When it was dark, a lot of strange things happened in this nursing home. In the corridors, there was often the sound of someone's footsteps walking very gracefully. In addition, it was the sound of some high heels stepping on the ground so loudly that it almost filled the entire space at the time. In particular, this was a woman wearing a red cheongsam, a traditional Chinese dress, which appeared, and they thought this might be the Miss Chen everyone was talking about. Then Miss Chen went to a room. After entering that room, Miss Chen went to sit next to an old woman and talk to her. The next morning, that old lady would die in that room, so the elderly in the nursing home all believed in the existence of Miss Chen. But when my aunt heard the story, she was confused and didn't know whether to believe if this rumor was true or not. As for the former employee, when she told the story, she also seemed to believe some of these things to be completely true. She told my aunt to be especially careful at night. On the next day, Miss Lu was sick and was taken to the hospital for emergency treatment, but she could not be cured and passed away that night. At first, my aunt thought it was just a coincidence, until one day she had to work the night shift. Their management style was very school-like, and at night they usually would turn off the lights, and no one was allowed to move around except if they wanted to go to the bathroom. It was around 11:40 p.m. when my aunt was in her office. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a sudden sound of footsteps outside the door, and it came from high heels. The problem was, the elderly people in the nursing home didn't wear high heels, and the staff there were not allowed to wear them, but there was a sound coming from those high heels. Out of curiosity, she got up and went to see who it was. When she was about to reach out to open the door, she suddenly got a little scared, and she remembered the story of Miss Chen at that moment. Although she didn't believe it to be true, my aunt was still a bit scared to be alone at night like that. After she was mentally prepared, she carefully opened the door gently, but she couldn't believe she just opened the door and then heard the sound of heels hitting the ground, and it was getting closer and clearer. At the time, she slowly poked her head out the door and looked in the direction of the noise. It was unbelievable when my aunt saw there was no sign of anyone at all, and the footsteps would become less and less audible. But the interesting thing was that the sound of the heels would turn in another direction. Because she was more curious than usual, she followed the sound of the shoes to see who it was. And when the sound of the high heels became more and more shrill, as if every step that woman took was weighing more and more on my aunt's heart, she got closer and her fear grew bigger and bigger. She became extremely worried. After walking for a while, she turned to another corner, but there was no road ahead. At that time, my aunt thought she would definitely meet this Miss Chen, but no, it was completely different from what she expected. She only vaguely saw a red patch drifting into a room in the middle of the night, and it was completely different from the explanation that the former employee had told her. Immediately she ran and chased into that room, but when she arrived there was nothing to see. She looked through the little window above the door. This machine still hadn't appeared, and the people there were sleeping peacefully. At that time, my aunt really didn't know if she had heard it wrongly or looked at it wrong. She also found the story really ridiculous and became more and more worried about whether the rumor was true or not. The next day, a colleague told my aunt about the trouble going on in the nursing home. There was an old man here who said that Miss Chen came to see him and he thought he was going to die, so he refused to get up and eat with everyone. After finishing a few errands in the nursing home, my aunt came to see the old man and talk to him about what had happened. When she found out that the old man's room was the room where the strange footsteps stopped, she was quite amazed. The old man passed away. This made her start to believe that the rumors might be true and that Miss Chen could actually exist. For this reason, my aunt went to ask a lot of elderly people in the nursing home what they knew about this Miss Chen. It was quite interesting that these people could describe Miss Chen, not only the color of her dress, but also her height. They could tell exactly what she looked like, but each person had a very different description of Miss Chen's face. Because my aunt had a background in art, she drew Miss Chen very well and beautifully with a tall and thin figure, her hair in a high bun. She was wearing a red cheongsam outfit and high heels, but my aunt couldn't draw her face because no one knew what Miss Chen's real face looked like.